Welcome, everybody. I'm Marco Santori. I'm the Chief Legal Officer at Kraken Digital Asset Exchange. We're one of the world's largest digital asset exchanges, and I think the best. I'm here today with Jerry Brito of Coin Center. Jerry, I have known for the better part of a decade now, and we've worked side by side on a number of policy issues, and I've learned a lot from Jerry. I thought this would be a great opportunity for everybody to learn a little bit more from him too. So Jerry, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Well, thank you, Marco. I'm Jerry Brito. I'm the Executive Director of Coin Center. And Marco, when did we meet? I think we met at the San Jose conference in 2013, 2012, 2013.
That could be it. That could be right. That's now 8-ish years ago, right?
Yeah, that's amazing. This is the big Bitcoin conference. Like, this was the Bitcoin conference that kind of first brought together all the weirdos who were working on Bitcoin.
And back then, like, the only legal precedent that we could all draw from was e-gold.
E-gold.
And there were lawyers shouting from the rooftops, the lessons to be learned from e-gold.
Yes.
And they weren't wrong. That there was very little besides e-gold back then, and there was much to learn. But wow, we've come a long way, haven't we?
Yes, and Liberty Reserve, if you remember.
Yes,
and
Liberty Reserve.
Yeah, and that always drove me crazy because what was at issue with Liberty Reserve was counterfeiting. And Bitcoin may be a lot of things, but it does not look like a dollar.
Yeah. So what brings us together today, though, after 8 years of shared experiences up and down in the legal world and the policy world, is a recent blossoming of donations and funding to Coin Center and Kraken. Among them, we recently made a sizable donation to Coin Center. We're here to talk about all of the substantive issues that drive that kind of donation, and to pretty shamelessly encourage you, at least on Kraken's behalf, on Kraken's part, to pretty shamelessly encourage you as well to donate to Coin Center. And we want to talk about some of the things that Coin Center does, and some of the issues that they tackle, and what they use this funding for. So Jerry, can you tell us a little bit about, just broadly, what does Coin Center do, and how do you work DC?
Sure. And first I should say, thank you for supporting Coin Center. You and Jesse and Kraken have been incredibly generous with Coin Center going back a couple of years. You initiated this, what has seemingly become a tradition of giving a vast amount of money and daring others to do the same and matching it. So thank you for that. So what is Coin Center? Coin Center is an independent nonprofit. We're based in DC, and we're focused on the public policy issues that affect cryptocurrencies and open permissionless blockchain networks. So things like Bitcoin, Ethereum, and the like. And we exist because these networks are public goods. Nobody owns them, right? It's by nature, they're permissionless, or like the internet. And while there are companies who are building on top of these networks like Kraken that can look out after their own interests, somebody's got to look after the interest of these networks as networks, right? As just open, permissionless, unowned public goods, and the interest of people who are using them and people who are writing software that develop and power them. And so that's what we exist to do. So in many ways, we're often seen as sort of an industry lobby group, when in fact what we are is a civil liberties group, and very much in the mold of the EFF, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, right? Who looks after the interest of the internet, not internet companies, but the internet and the right to use the internet. So that's what we are. And so what do? We do 3 things. We do education, public policy research, and advocacy. Education is where we spend a lot of our time, making sure that policymakers understand the technology, right? If they have a question, they want to pick up the phone and call Bitcoin, they can't, right? Because it's an unknown public good. Hopefully they can call us and we can answer their technical questions about what it is, how it works, why it matters. And that's important because so much of what can go wrong with regulation and policymaking is not out of malice, but out of ignorance, right? So just making sure they have a plain English, just the facts understanding of the technology is a lot of what we do. We do that through one-on-one meetings, one-to-many briefings, publish a lot of educational materials, some of which you've authored on our website. So that's a lot of what we do. As we have conversations with policymakers about this, we inevitably will get questions that we don't have the answers to. And typically that's going to be a question not about the tech, which we can answer or find somebody who can answer, but it's a question of the law and where the technology has outpaced the law and there's a gap, and regulators are probably going to want to fill that gap. And so that's where we engage in the second thing that we do, which is policy research. And so, Peter Van Valkenburg, who you know, heads that up for us. And so what we do is we develop the policy thinking to help regulators meet their end while preserving as much as possible the freedom to innovate. And we do that typically through reports where we identify a gap, we lay out alternative ways you might want to fill that gap, and we make a recommendation. And the recommendations we make are sort of based on, again, making sure that we have as much freedom to innovate as we can. That said, there's certain red lines that we will never cross, right? So constitutional rights, for example, are not negotiable. And the last thing we do is we advocate. So we advocate for our preferred policy prescriptions. And Robin Wiseman, who you also know, heads that up for us. She's our lobbyist. And so we go to folks in Congress, the same folks who are having conversations, educating and saying, hey, this is the way you should do it. This is a law you should adopt. These are laws you should not, et cetera. We do the same thing at the state level, at the agency level, et cetera. So sorry, I went on for a while, but that's what we do.
No, I appreciate you doing it. As I hear this, my immediate reaction is, Jerry, why is any of this necessary? Bitcoin is anti-fragile. The harder you attack it, the harder it comes back and builds itself stronger. And Bitcoin is a juggernaut, and governments can't stop it. So why do we need you? Can't Bitcoin take? Isn't it the honey badger of money?
Yeah. So it's a good question. I think it's true that Bitcoin is unstoppable, right? And even if it were outright banned, you wouldn't be able to stop it from running, and you wouldn't be able to stop people from using it. But you could very much retard its impact, right? You could raise the costs of running it and using it, and we don't want that. Right. And I think for Bitcoin and things like it to be truly successful, you want it to have wide adoption. You want people to be able to use it without, any sort of concern. So do I want to live in is Bitcoin going to survive government attacks? Yes. Do I want to live in a world where we don't have government attacks, or if we do, that they're defeated, or if they're not defeated, that they be as mild as they can be? Yeah, that's the world I'd rather live in.
Yeah, it makes sense. So let's talk about some of that governmental interaction now. We've got a lot on the policy plate coming up this year. The year started off in December, in fact, and as these years tend to do. What's that expression? Oh boy, last week was a hell of a year, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And that's how we all felt when FinCEN published its notice of proposed rulemaking for a new currency transaction report required for transfers to unhosted wallets, self-custody wallets, as we would call them.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, where to begin? So what's interesting is that for us, this actually began much earlier than December. Went as far back as February of last year, when Secretary Mnuchin first in the hearing brought up the idea that self-hosted wallets were problematic, that they would be the equivalent of Swiss numbered bank accounts, and that he wasn't going to stand for that, and that there would be new rules coming out, which perked up our ears. There were conversations that we had at Treasury related to that immediately after he made those statements. And we felt at that time that they had been sort of satisfied that that would not that would not be a good idea. And then the pandemic hit. And so certainly the secretary had much more important or pressing things on his plate than self-hosted wallet regulation. And so it kind of went away. But then starting in the fall, as we approached the end of the presidential term, it came right back. And I think
that timing is actually sort of common. It's this is a phenomenon called the midnight period, right? And I mean, you know about it better than I do.
Yeah, I mean, I think as it became clear that there wouldn't be a second Trump term, the secretary, and this happened, as you say, this happens in every administration, especially when the administration is switching over from one party to another. The different principals and different agencies will realize if they want to accomplish, if they had a long list of priorities they wanted to get through, they need to get them through now before, they, like Cinderella, turn back into a pumpkin at midnight or whatever. And so, he wanted to get regulation on self-hosted wallets done before he left office. Unfortunately, normally when you do a regulation, the standard thing is to, so by law, an agency is required to put out a proposed regulation for public comment. You have to publish it in the Federal Register and give notice, and then take public comment. And typically there's 60 days given to the public to give notice and then to take comment. At the end of 60 days, you get all the comments you received, you go through them, you have to consider them all, you have to address all substantive arguments made in those comments, and then you can put out a final rule. So it's typically going to be at least 60, probably more, closer to 90 days, how long it takes to put out a rule. And
but that's not what we got.
The secretary did not have 90 days, right? And so initially, what he wanted to do was to put out what's called an interim final rule. And an interim final rule is when there is some kind of emergency that can be cited, or some kind of situation where by giving notice of the rule, it would undermine the effect of the very rule, right? So when you have that kind of situation, an agency under law is allowed to not give notice, basically announce the rule as effective immediately, and then take comment. And after that comment period is over, amend the rule if it sees fit. And so that was what he wanted to do. He wanted to come out with an interim final rule that would require new cash transaction reports for cryptocurrency, and probably more importantly, counterparty identification, so that somebody like Kraken has to know not just its customer, but its customer's customer, right? Who is that person paying? Which would have been terrible for lots of reasons. The good news is that we and others worked kind of behind the scenes to make sure that Treasury and others in government understood, number one, that this would be a disaster. Number two, that it would be challenged, so that we did not get an interim final rule. We got an actual proposed rule, okay, so that we could comment and we could have a say in. And a lot of that actually was done by sort of talking to our friends in law enforcement, who, by the way, as far as we can tell, don't really want this rule, don't see a need for this kind of counterpart.
I got to tell you, I mean, I got just as many frantic calls from law enforcement as I did from other industry participants in the course of this thing. They were just baffled by the by why anybody would want a world where it was so inconvenient to do business via regulated entities,
right?
Because the only way law enforcement gets its information about the crimes that it hopes to prevent and investigate and interdict is through regulated entities like us, like Kraken. But the rule, they saw as clear as day, just as most of us did, that the rule would create this shadow system
Yeah,
this,
and
this sort of shadow banking.
if you sort of announce this rule as final on, immediately on day one without giving any sort of comment, what I think a lot of firms, maybe Kraken included, you could tell me, would kind of feel compelled to do immediately is to not allow transactions to self-hosted wallets. That's the easiest way to comply, is just don't touch self-hosted wallets. And what would that do to law enforcement's visibility that they depend on? It would just cut it off completely.
Yeah, and Kraken wrote, Kraken submitted a comment letter on this topic. In fact, the second half, the trailing half of our comment letter was designed to explain this phenomenon that exists really only in decentralized permissionless networks, which I still think deserves a name of this phenomenon, but we haven't come up with it yet, where you can really opt out of the centralized regulated intermediaries in crypto. You can opt out of them in a way that you cannot opt out of them in the traditional banking system. So when regulators go to regulate banks and other financial services businesses, well, the users sometimes get a worse experience, right?
Right.
The consequence of that, though, to the regulator isn't significant because they don't have anywhere to go. The users still use the regulated intermediaries and the regulators still get the information they need. But in the world of crypto, in the world of decentralized permissionless networks, the users can just opt out. They can just leave, and then they go and they use even more decentralized tools that are, despite being more decentralized, less convenient. And they do that, they do that because the centralized intermediaries that are subject to these regulations have created an even less convenient environment to use crypto. It's something like displacement. It's like this opt-out displacement.
Well, it reminds me of voice and exit, right? So in the regulated intermediated world, you only have voice as an option where you can sort of try to explain why this isn't gonna, why this is gonna be a bad experience for everybody. But if it doesn't work, you're stuck. In crypto, you've got voice and exit, right? And it's not just the users, by the way, who have that exit option. It's also the regulated parties, because if a firm can finds that they can't do business within a regulated space, they might pivot to building completely decentralized tools that are not subject to regulation. So something else for regulators to think about.
Okay, so catch us up. Where are we now with the FinCEN saga?
So you're right. If I went through everything, we would be here for hours. So where are we? Where we are is that we were successful, the whole community was successful in getting making sure that the rule was not finalized under the Trump administration, under Secretary Mnuchin. And so it went now into the Biden administration, which means that the prime mover of this thing, which was Secretary Mnuchin, is no longer around. And all of the other folks who are most interested in this, which is, like you say, law enforcement and FinCEN and the like, they don't, as far as I can tell, see the need for the most extreme parts of this rule. And so, and they also certainly don't see the need for rushing this through. The only reason to rush this through is because Secretary Mnuchin was leaving office. So now that we're past him, we're in a position where the rule has been extended, or the comment period for the rule has been extended for another 60 days. So now we're back to a normal process where people can give feedback. And it's kind of weird, but at the tail end of the Trump administration, Secretary Mnuchin kind of conceded in giving more time, but the way that it was done, it was very weird. And the rule was kind of bifurcated into kind of two proposals, right? You have the CTR requirement, cash transaction report requirement, and then the counterparty identification requirement. All of the comments that were received before that were mostly about the counterparty identification piece, because that was the most dire pressing thing. It's my expectation that, if if everything goes as we expect it to, there really, with Mnuchin gone, there really isn't much desire for that counterparty identification piece, the worst piece of that. So with any luck, I think what we will see at the end of the process in a few months' time is a final rule that does include the CTR piece, and we can talk about why that is, but does not include any of the counterparty identification piece, which is the worst part. That could change, but that's my expectation at the moment. And so where we are now is we have, a few less than 60 days, but we have certainly over a month to file comments about the CTR piece.
I got to say that strikes me as a good result.
Oh yeah.
If that's what we ultimately end up with, well, it's certainly a far cry from the original proposal, which I think there was pretty broad consensus did not make sense and would have worked against law enforcement. But just on its own, it's also strikes me as, in terms of reasonable expansions of government surveillance powers, strikes me as not crazy. But, I don't know if you recall in New York,
yeah.
so long as we're walking down memory lane, in New York in 2014, Jen Shasky Calvary, was
former director of FinCEN.
Was then director of FinCEN. I think it was 2014. It was right around then.
That's all right. Yeah.
She was asked on a panel after she had published the guidance, the original guidance in March of 2013. She was asked on a panel, well, what's next? What's the next new bit of government of regulation to come out of FinCEN for crypto? And she said, well, I'd like to see a VCTR.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, what is a virtual currency transaction report?
Yep.
Huh. And of course, this was a different Bitcoin crowd. It was just Bitcoin, and the room erupted. You were there. I mean, I'm telling you what you saw, but the room erupted. There were neckbeards and tutus going afray, and it was it was a bit of history, right? Because Bitcoiners, there was no crypto back then. It was just Bitcoiners. Bitcoiners were being confronted with the regulatory realities of this country. This is before Coin Center too, right? This is pre-coin. I think you were still at Mercatus. Any of that. So this is not new. This concept is not new, but for a long time, I think those who looked at it were trying to find a reasonable way of applying it, and it just it's hard to do. I mean, I think it's hard being a crypto lawyer, being a crypto regulator, man. Juggling these policy considerations is not easy.
Yeah, and I mean, to your point, since she said that, we've been expecting a virtual currency transaction report proposal to come forward, and it's amazing, quite frankly, that cryptocurrency was not subject to it for 6 years after that, right? So we've been kind of living on borrowed time in a way. And here's the bottom line. I am no fan of the Bank Secrecy Act. It is a warrantless surveillance regime, no different from what NSA does with PRISM, right? Snooping on your telephone conversations, except we somehow accept it. So anyhow, I don't like the Bank Secrecy Act. But that said, to the extent it exists, what we've always asked for at Coin Center, as far as crypto goes, is parities. We want to be treated no differently and no worse than existing traditional financial intermediaries. And in many ways, or in one particular way, crypto has actually been treated better because there has been no cash transaction report requirement, which banks do face. And so it was really only a matter of time before there was parity brought to bear, and crypto was brought to parity with traditional financial institutions. Again, I don't like it, but then that's an issue not of challenging the CTR requirement. That's an issue of challenging the BSA period, right? That's different.
So speaking of taking on big challenges, there's a lot to talk about. We could talk about tax consequences. We could talk about, you know, financial services regulatory developments with the new administration coming in. But we only have so much time, and I want to talk about a broader theme, which is timing.
Yeah.
I have always taken the position, and Jerry, you know this, I think this has maybe been frustrating for you, but I have always taken the position that crypto should keep its head down.
Oh,
and
okay.
we
Oh, I thought you were going to say the opposite.
well, for years, I've taken the position that crypto should keep its head down in the policy in DC by getting loud with regulators. We would be raising very complex issues, the answers to that suggest really difficult questions, the answers to which we might not like, and because of the relative size of crypto, because of public perception of crypto, it would be pretty difficult to guide ourselves to a good result there. We just didn't have the resources. We didn't have the support among the public. We didn't have the financial resources. We didn't have the experience in dealing in DC. We didn't have the people placed where we wanted them. And so getting loud in DC would mostly just call attention to issues we couldn't defend. But I don't know, over the last year, I feel like that's really changed. I don't think it's just the price going up. I think they actually share a common cause, the price going up, in my opinion, of this changing. And that the crypto lobby is the wrong word, even though it might be the right word where you live. Crypto supporters are everywhere now. People are seeing something here, and is now the time to get loud?
Yeah, no, I don't think so. And it depends on what you mean by loud, right? We're loud when we have to be, right? So in this most recent FinCEN thing we just talked about, there were 7,000 comments filed in the proceeding, which is more comments than FinCEN has received almost in its history.
That's pretty loud.
In one single, so that's fine, right? If that's what you mean by loud, then yes, we do need to be loud when it's called for. But if by loud you mean kind of offensively, sort of seeking
bull in a china shop loud.
Yeah, that's not good. And it's not good for a couple of reasons. For one, because I don't think that's how you get anything done in DC. And DC, despite everything, and it's sad that it's becoming more and more polarized, but that just means nothing gets accomplished. To the extent that anything gets accomplished in DC, it happens through long, hard just conciliation and incremental, working behind the scenes, et cetera. That's the way anything gets done in DC. But probably also more to your point, I totally agree that crypto and Bitcoin and crypto is stronger than it's ever been, and we certainly appreciate that. Like as you were mentioning the fundraising that we've been able to do at Coin Center over the past year, we've never seen so much support from the community, from just individuals, who stand up as we've seen this year. So that's fantastic. That said, I don't think despite all that, and despite it feels amazing to us in crypto to feel like we are this growing force and there's a crypto person everywhere, right? In every organization, there's a crypto person, and that's fantastic. We are still not big enough, and we're still not rich enough, and we're still, it's still not there. I think there are ideas. I think people often look to Uber, right? Uber was able to get through so many regulatory hurdles by mobilizing their user base. And I'm not sure that that's replicable with crypto for a whole host of reasons that, I'd be happy to get into, but it might take some time. But yeah, so my approach has been, and I think it continues to be the one that I would want to pursue, which is you meet policymakers where they are. When they have a question, you answer it. and you answer it forthrightly, and you develop your, you try to develop your policy thinking ahead of time as much as you can, trying to see where the policy conversation is going, but you meet folks where they are. That doesn't mean that there's not going to come for us to be loud when we have to be. So again, if this FinCEN rule, we were pretty loud, and if it had gone the other way, and it had been approved, we and others would have fought in court. We would have spent a lot of money lobbying. We would have done a lot, right? But look, it didn't. And how was it successful that it didn't? It was a lot of just conversations and playing the game and stretching things out and delaying. And it's not just delaying for the sake of delaying. It's seeking
the time to get it right. Absolutely, absolutely. This is like this is a constant question, right? It's evergreen and perennial, and that what does it mean to do good advocacy? And I think a lot of people do think it's just being loud and making your voice heard. And I think that works in a lot of circumstances, and it works super well on social media. But it's just a different game when it comes to governmental policy. Acting as a conduit for an industry is a different conversation than acting as a conduit for a technology, which is a different conversation than acting as a conduit for your users. It's complex stuff. But I can tell you, we at Kraken are delighted to have you supporting the technology and supporting the community, the developers, and everybody else who keeps this thing running. So listen, thank you very much for taking the time and sitting down with me today. I want to give you the last word, but I do want to put in a plug for Coin Center and say that the work that Coin Center does is critical to our growth as a community and as an industry, and I think you should support it. And Jerry, I'll let you tell them how.
Well, thank you, Marco. It means a lot to have Kraken support, and everybody who supports us really makes a difference. Yeah, if you want to support us, go to coincenter.org. There's a donate button at the top right. You click that and it'll explain it to you. You can support with crypto, with a credit card. We have certain thank you gifts that we'll give at certain levels. So yeah, it's like any nonprofit. We really appreciate you making our work possible.
Thanks a lot, Sherry.
Thank you.